Good morning, everyone. My name is Bryanna Entwistle, and I'm a Press and Program Officer here at the Asia-Society Policy Institute. I'm joined today by Sue-Lin Wong, Jacob Sims, and Dr. Selina Ho. Over the next 60 minutes, we will dig into the current state of the cyberscam industry in Southeast Asia, what the US and China have done to disrupt it, and the next steps needed for its sustained dismantlement. Scam centers in Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos are estimated to generate over 40 billion USD annually from elaborate fraud schemes. Among the most popular of these schemes is known as pig butchering, which involves a scammer building up a relationship with someone online, luring them into investing in a fraudulent scheme, and then taking their money. Run predominantly by criminal syndicates that were pushed out of China following Xi Jinping's anti-corruption and crime campaign of the early 2010s, these criminals shifted from operating gambling rings to running cyber scams during the COVID-19 pandemic. They began by targeting Chinese nationals who lost an estimated $33.8 billion in 2023. But after Beijing began a crackdown on scam centers, predominantly in Myanmar, that same year, transnational criminal groups pivoted to target the Western world. While the Chinese government reported a decrease in losses from scams in 2024, the US witnessed a 42% increase as Americans lost around $10 billion that same year. The people losing money aren't the only victims of this industry. Experts suggest that upwards of 300,000 people have been trafficked into scam centers to run these fraud schemes, hailing from across Asia and as far away as Western Africa. In late 2025, both the US and China separately ramped up pressure on the Cambodian government to address its scam industry, which is estimated to bring in as much as $19 billion annually, equivalent to nearly 40% of the country's formal GDP. In February, Prime Minister Hun Manet pledged to clean up online scamming and eradicate scam centers by the end of April. The Cambodian government claims to have shut down 250 centers and deported nearly 16,000 people linked to all scam operations. However, according to a recent study by Amnesty International, more than 70% of scam compounds they track were essentially bypassed and remain operational after the raids. Politically connected high-level operators have escaped accountability and have relocated their operations both within the Mekong region and outside of it, to Timor-Leste, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and beyond. Today, we will look at US-China approaches to combating cyber scams in Southeast Asia, identify why these interventions haven't been enough to disrupt the industry, and discuss what needs to come next, including the possibility of any future US-China coordination on this issue. And with that, let me introduce our speakers. Sue-Lin Wong is an Asia correspondent at The Economist and the host and co-creator behind the award-winning series The Prince, which won the Asia Society's Osborne Elliott Prize for Journalism in 2023, and Scam Inc., which won both a Peabody Award and an Overseas Press Club Award. In Scam Inc., Sue-Lin dives into the global implications of Southeast Asia's underground scam economy, and she'll bring insights from years of reporting on the issue to the conversation today. Jacob Sims is an analyst recognized for his work on transnational crime, authoritarian political economy, and related security challenges in the Indo-Pacific. He serves as a visiting fellow at Harvard University's Asia Center, a senior advisor for transnational crime and emerging threats at Inca Digital, and a columnist for The Diplomat. Dr. Selina Ho is a Dean's Chair Associate Professor in International Affairs and the Vice Dean for Research and Development at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. She's a leading expert on Chinese foreign policy and the author of a 2025 report on how and when Beijing has decided to intervene against criminal syndicates in Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia. Thank you to Sue-Lin, Jacob, and Selina for joining this call today, both early in the US and late in Singapore. And without further ado, let's dive into the conversation. So starting with Sue-Lin, can you walk us through what your recent reporting tells us about the state of the scam industry in July of 2026?
Thanks, Bryanna, and it's great to be here. I thought I would actually take a step back and share a bit of my own story of how I came to reporting on the scam industry. So I moved to Singapore about 3.5 years ago to cover Southeast Asia, very broadly, sort of society and politics. And I started traveling around the region. And everywhere I went, doing stories unrelated to the scam industry, I would hear about the rise of scams in this part of the world. And I thought that was really odd that this seemed to be a massive story connecting the whole region, and decided to dig into it. And what I discovered was that we were sort of misunderstanding what we were seeing. I think a lot of us had a perception that when we got a WhatsApp message from someone asking if we were still down for coffee on a Thursday, or an urgent SMS about a delivery, we sort of assumed it was maybe a guy in a hoodie sitting in his parents' basement. But It really wasn't that. It was a multi-billion-dollar industry operating in an incredibly sophisticated way. And a lot of these scam operations are run like legitimate corporations, with an HR department, a finance department, an R&D department that's figuring out how to use AI and sort of cryptocurrencies to the best of their advantages. Very, very sophisticated recruiting techniques. Low-level scammers that are sending out the messages, and high-level scammers that are going in for the kill when they steal, our money, sometimes our life savings. And so I turned this into an 8-part podcast series called Scam Inc., really trying to understand this as a multi-billion-dollar industry. We estimated that each year the industry as a whole perhaps makes more than 500 billion US dollars globally, which would put it on a par with the global illicit drug trade as one of the biggest criminal industries in the whole world. And so that's really what set me off on my reporting. And I think just a few big frameworks that I try to bear in mind as I've continued to cover the industry over the past few years is that corruption really, really drives a lot of what we're seeing. So in countries like Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, the Philippines, everywhere else that we're now seeing the scam industry proliferate to, there's very systemic corruption happening, across business, across politics, and the criminals can take advantage of that. I'm sure we'll get into this more in this talk, but that's a really, really important driver of this industry. I would say a second important thing to bear in mind is the reality that there are so many talented university graduates across our region in Southeast Asia, but across the world, who perhaps are the first people in their families to go to university. And they might be multilingual, English might be their third language. And they graduate into job markets where there just aren't that many jobs. The average wage across most of Southeast Asia is a couple of $100 US a month. And so if you have an industry that's making 500 billion US dollars a year, there's so much money that people think they can make by getting into this industry. And so if we don't tackle sort of creating great jobs and legitimate opportunities across developing economies, I think it becomes very, very difficult to sort of curb this industry. So that would be my second point, that we have to think about sort of how youth unemployment plays into this industry. And then the third thing I would say, which Bryanna alluded to, is that this industry is kind of whack-a-mole. So even if a particular government is able to genuinely crack down on the rise of the scam industry in their own country, unlike, running a meth farm where it's incredibly difficult to relocate, for scams, all you need is an internet connection, a couple of laptops, and a couple of smartphones. And so criminal groups can pick up and very quickly relocate to places like Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Malaysia, which we're hearing are now growing hotspots. And of course, this isn't now just contained to Southeast Asia. We're seeing this industry spread around the world. So I would say, for those of us based in the region in Southeast Asia, we've been following the rise of the scam industry for the past few years. But unfortunately, I think it hasn't been curbed. If anything, it's just getting bigger and bigger. And that's perhaps why it's becoming more and more of an issue in the US and globally.
Thank you, Sue-Lin. You alluded to some of the movement in the industry and the whack-a-mole nature of it. In part due to Cambodia's recent, scam crackdowns. A lot of these have been moving around the world. Jake, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what Cambodia's crackdown has looked like, as well as the role of the U.S. and, bringing that about, as well as the U.S.'s broader anti-scam strategy in Southeast Asia.
Sure. So I'll address that in two parts. And thank you, Bryanna, and thank you to Aspi for hosting this. It's a good time to refresh and kind of see where we've come from. And I'll follow Sue-Lin's cue here and give a little bit of background on how I came into this, because it sort of contextualizes my answer. If we look back just like 5 years onto this issue, there were probably a dozen or so English speakers in the world who knew about this. And so it's very easy to look at today and see the Cambodian government responding with at least rhetorical strength and and actually doing a real crackdown, and also the U.S. government being a loud and aggressive responder to this issue. But I think if you look at this issue in historical context, 5 years ago, that is not the case at all. And I actually would say, like, one of the ways I characterize the response is a very, very slow response from both of those two countries. Back at that point, I say like maybe a dozen or so people, English speakers, were aware of the issue. The Chinese government was quite aware already, and the Cambodian, the industry in Cambodia had grown to a massive proportion. So as we look at this conversation, I think it's important to recognize that the response is still in its very early stages. This issue has obviously grown to a massive issue, but we are still very much in the early stages of a global response. So with that little bit of extra background, I would say what we're seeing in Cambodia since January 2026 is no longer what I think most of the Cambodian government's response could be classified, which is effectively a series of denials and fake responses, fake crackdowns, performative crackdowns that have marked most of the last 5 years, and is converted into what I would say is certainly a real crackdown. But as I think I said in conversation with Sue-Lin a couple of weeks ago, it's real but selective. It has targeted the physical infrastructure, the front end of the scam compounds themselves, but it has left intact the underlying political economy, the key actors, and done very, very little to hold accountable the people who are actually running the compounds, who own the land, who have provided the political protection. And it has done even less to provide protection for the vulnerable workers who have ended up, according to the Cambodian government, 290,000 people have left the country that were related to the scam industry just in the last year. And if those numbers are to be believed, and you compare that with the anecdotal evidence that's been gathered by local civil society over the last 5 years, the vast majority of those people were held under some degree of what we call forced criminality, so normatively modern slaves. Now, there's no good data to say what exact percentage, but a large number of those people were held under conditions of limited agency that have risen in well-documented cases to torture, abuse, extrajudicial killings, and widespread constraint of movement, passport confiscation, et cetera, et cetera. The Cambodian government, I guess, in short, has done much in the last 6 months to disrupt the front end of the industry, but a lot of the underlying conditions are still present. The U.S. as well. I think if you look at most of this 5-year period, you could classify the response as slow to respond. But the response that has emerged has been overwhelmingly enforcement-led. And each step in that enforcement trajectory has sort of widened the aperture. You started out about a year or two ago seeing the initial U.S. government sanctions, which have escalated into a large number of entities and actors being sanctioned. About a year ago, you saw the U.S. Scam Center Strike Force stood up that sort of institutionalized interagency investigations and prosecutions. And then about 6 months ago, the enactment of an executive order from the White House signaling a more durable whole of government effort against the wider scam ecosystem. And the paradox to that response has been that this enforcement-driven response has relied almost exclusively, still very heavily, on a key element of a now largely abandoned U.S. approach, which is an evidence pipeline for that enforcement work that has relied largely on local pro-democracy and civil society actors, local journalists, civil society groups, survivor networks. And over the last 18 months, U.S. policy has shifted towards enforcement, but also simultaneously reduced support for the civic and institutional infrastructure on which effective enforcement still really, really depends. And so just sort of closing that answer out, accountability, enforcement is a really strong needed component of the response, but it's not everything. sort of U.S. enforcement response is limited by global exposure to the dollar system, and it also relies really heavily on host government systems that, like Sue-Lin and I have said already, have been shown to be deeply complicit with the crime. And so I would say as the U.S. moves forward, a more holistic response would mean targeting that enforcement higher and higher up into the ultra elite circles with greater frequency and precision, reinvesting in that evidence pipeline, and then more broadly trying to attract partners that are strategically aligned in their interest to join in that fight. Thanks.
Thanks, Jake. As you mentioned, the U.S. response really only ramping up in the past year, and the Chenza indictment and sanctions of October 2025 really being emblematic of that, has been a huge part in enforcing what we've seen in Cambodia. Selina, I want to turn to you. As Jake alluded that, again, China has been working on this for a long, long time, as far back as 2023, given the primary focus on Chinese-speaking nationals as victims before the industry started pivoting to Americans. So I just wanted to ask you, how has China's anti-scam offensive evolved since 2023? What are the drivers? When do they choose to act? And how do they execute upon it?
Thank you very much, Bryanna, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you all for participating and getting, this is a great opportunity for me to get in touch with Sue-Lin and Jacob as well. I just want to give some background to how actually what happened in China and how did that lead to this global scam industry, right? So going back to that context, and then I'll go into describing and explaining what is the shape of China's anti-scam offensive and, the varieties of actors that it has engaged with in the region and in what manner. I think we have to go back to when President Xi Jinping came into power in 2013, when he started his anti-corruption and anti-crime crackdown. So what happened was a lot of businesses, a lot of illegal businesses, actually, illicit activities, online gambling, haven't gone online yet at the point, but gambling was outlawed in the country. And so this anti-corruption, anti-crime wave actually drove some of these illegal activities out to places like Macau. From Macau, they traveled to Southeast Asia when the Chinese government went after those in Macau. And then Myanmar, the border areas in Myanmar, the border areas that are around Yunnan, the operations moved there. These illicit group syndicates, organized crime, they moved to these areas. And also the border areas in Cambodia, not the border areas with Cambodia, but the Cambodia-Thailand border areas, and Laos as well. So you see all these activities moving out because of what's happening within China. You will see that because it's so lucrative, right? So they have to find, criminal groups have to find a way out, okay? So they moved to Southeast Asia, and now what we are seeing is that because of the crackdown in Southeast Asia, it's moved elsewhere to other parts of the world. It's become a global crime industry, and different mafia groups, syndicate groups are actually learning from the Chinese. Now, what came to a head, though, for the Chinese was, I think, when during COVID, a lot of these casinos, illegal ones, actually became, well, you don't have customers because borders are closed, right? A lot of these customers come across the border from Yunnan, Chinese customers crossing over from Yunnan into places like Myanmar. So with the borders closed, these human beings crossing these borders, they couldn't go across. So you have online gambling. Online gambling came about, and then you have pig butchering, right? Which is using, feelings and emotions to trap people into schemes and scams and all that. So what happened was China realized what happened when its borders opened up, that this whole industry has spread and became like a pandemic, basically, along its border areas. And that's when it became really concerned. So we're talking about 2023, 2022. But let me just go back a little bit more. There are efforts before by China to try and convince the Cambodian government, the Myanmar government, whichever one is in place at that point in time, to try and do something about these activities. Now, how do I, as an academic, come about doing this? Why do I do scams? That's not something that academics actually research on, generally speaking, unless you're doing criminal law and stuff like that. So the reason why I came about doing this is because of the Belt and Road Initiative. So at the same time, when all these anti-crime groups, this anti-crime campaign and anti-corruption campaign was happening in China, pushing out the criminal groups, the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, was launched in the same year, 2013, that President Xi Jinping came into power. So what you see here is these criminal groups actually going out with the infrastructure drive overseas that China was having. So it's all tied up with the BRI. A lot of these businesses actually label themselves as illicit businesses, label themselves as BRI projects so that they have a veneer of legitimacy. This is what happened. This is the background to it. It is tied up to infrastructure. It's tied up to BRI. Now, the way I got involved in it is because my work is involved with the BRI on infrastructure. So one of the field trips I went to Cambodia, and one of the things that we discovered was we're talking about trains and infrastructures, roads and highways, but the people that we spoke to keep telling us about Sihanoukville. Sihanoukville is this area where it became notorious for all the Chinese criminal gangs there. And it became a problem. It became such a big problem that there was a public outcry from the Cambodians themselves, the public. So it was only around 2019 that you see the Cambodian government being willing to act, primarily because the public outrage has grown to the extent that the Cambodian government was willing to act, even though there was some pressure from China to do it before. So let me just talk about some of the measures that China has been doing in intervening in all these scams and trying to put a stop to all of these. And maybe later on we can talk about why it would want to put a stop to all these things and what kind of interests are being affected here. But there are a variety of ways, and one way is to look at them as more direct interventions, meaning that China actually inserts itself into the domestic politics of these countries. They insert into the security apparatus, the police apparatus. They do joint law enforcement activities, setting up police stations, and they also send public security and police forces across the border. So there's all these attempts to crack down on scam centers and arrest criminals, right? And they also cooperate with a lot of non-state actors. So they don't just cooperate with governments, but also non-state actors. In particular, in Myanmar, we're talking about the ethnic armed organizations. So the EAOs, as we call them, the ethnic groups, they're actually fighting the civil war right now with the junta, right? So China has influence with the EAOs. They also cooperate with the EAOs in order to leverage them to use it as a sort of pressure point on the military, the Myanmar military to act. Now, there's also more indirect intervention. And by indirect intervention, I meant the kind of measures that they use within their own borders. Generally, trying to tighten up their own security, the security of their own borders. They also try and exert pressure on host governments to try to tighten up their own laws, the criminal systems to deal with this. They also cooperate with third countries or multilateral organizations like the Interpol or under the framework of the Langjiang-Mekong cooperation, which China has with the 5 other Mekong countries. So basically, what's really interesting, though, that is, China deals with both state and non-state actors in the way that they intervene, but they also do bilateral, trilateral, and multilateral cooperation. Now, this is interesting because traditionally, China prefers bilateral cooperation. But in this case, with trying to deal with crime, the criminal groups, it is quite clear that bilateral interventions are not going to be sufficient because they cross borders and they travel from places to places. So that's why you have trilateral and multilateral kind of arrangements. That's it. Thanks, Bryanna.
Thanks, Selina. And before moving on, I just want to flag that we're going to try to save around 10 minutes at the end of this for Q&A. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please put them in the chat box below. So Selina, following up on one of the things that you mentioned was this idea of when and how China, decides to act. And so I wanted to dig a little bit more into the drivers behind when they decide to crack down heavily, like they've done in Myanmar, versus when they've delayed their reactions a little bit, like in the case of Cambodia, really only putting pressure on in the last 6 months to extradite some key actors. So what are those drivers? When do they decide to really crack the whip?
Yeah, so the way that me and my co-authors for this project that you mentioned, the report that you mentioned, well, it's actually a journal article, so so the way we look at it is that there are two factors involved here. One is how serious is this damage to Chinese interests? Right. So what level of damage are we talking about? And here, what do we mean by Chinese interests? Chinese interests include harm to its own citizens, how much media attention there is, how much international media attention there is, and there is damage to China's international reputation. So these are considerations that when we talk about the extent of damage to Chinese interests. I think the other factor that we think about is the extent of the cooperation of the host countries, meaning the extent of the cooperation of countries like Cambodia and Myanmar and Laos, right? Because China cannot work alone. There are limits to what it can do outside its own borders. So if you have a host country that is actually much more cooperative, then you see that China can intervene in a certain way. And if they cannot, they can do more, right? But if they are not cooperative, then you'll see that the interventions tend to be less direct, and they will have to continue exerting pressure. But there isn't that much that they can do in terms of going into the country, inserting themselves into all these operations against criminal groups, and bring them back to Chinese soil. So all these are factors to think about why China would want to be involved, and how and to the extent where it can be involved. And I think you can see some of these. I mean, we mentioned Cambodia quite a lot just now. So like I said, the Cambodian, this huge outcry about Sihanoukville has been going on for a little while. And it finally came to the Chinese government's attention, the one in the Chinese government in Beijing's attention. And finally, they started to put pressure on the Cambodian government to act, but it took a long time. And it was only when around 2018, 2019, when things reached a level where there's so much public outrage over the lawlessness and criminal activities that are in Sihanoukville, that the Chinese was able to get some agreements from the Cambodian government to act. So in that way, a China Cambodia Law Enforcement Cooperation Office was set up in Phnom Penh. I think that was a significant milestone in getting the Cambodian government's cooperation. Now, in the case of Myanmar, I mean, there's a lot of report out there actually about how China actually leveraged this Operation 1027. So to give some background, Operation 1027 is what happened. Okay, so the date 1027 is the date. Okay, 27 October 27, 2023. There was an alliance of the EAOs, the ethnic armed organizations in Myanmar. Three EAOs actually got together and started to launch an operation and attack on the military. This group is known as the Three Brotherhood Alliance. So the way they put it across as the activities is not just to launch all these attacks against Myanmar, the military in Myanmar, but also as a way of saying that they are going to try and crack down on these scams. So that got China's support. But at the same time, China was using this operation, which actually, was devastating for the military junta in Myanmar, leveraged this operation and use it as a pressure point on the junta to act. So that is what some of the interventions that China has done. And you can see from here that it's willing to act when the damage to its interests is actually quite extensive already. And then, but it also depends on the cooperation of the host countries.
On those 2 points, Jake, I think you have some very important insights regarding the relationship between the industry and state actors that, both serve as hosts, but also within the Chinese government's relationship to some of these Chinese-linked criminal syndicates. So can you explain to us, how these relationships between the state and host countries, as well as the Chinese state and criminal syndicates, influenced both Beijing and Washington's strategic thinking about cyber scams?
Well, sure. And it's a pretty complex question. Probably won't be able to fully ingest that. But I think when you're talking about the relationship of state actors to the industry, I really like Selina's framework and I think it doesn't really just apply to China, but also to other actors like the US that are trying to get involved. That, the main factor is we might want to think that that governments are seeing this as a crime that's hurting their citizens, and so therefore there will be a uniform response to address it and combat it holistically. But there is a much wider array of interests at play in every state actor with relation to this industry because of how massive of a political and economic engine it has become. And so absolutely. Both in China and the US, you can see that a response has emerged in parallel with the rise of realization of how devastating it can be to national interests. And you've definitely seen both countries start to respond. The limitations, I think most of my answer I'll spend talking about this, but there are severe limitations when you have elite level host government complicity or effectively no real government partner to work in. So that's the case of Cambodia and Myanmar distinctively. The third piece that I think is really important is it's not just the interests caused by the crime. It's not just the lack of host government collaboration, but it also has a lot to do with, if you're looking at the US or China's response, their response is both driven and limited by the array of other interests that they have with that host government, which has a big impact on how hard and in what ways these larger hegemonic powers feel like they can push. And in the US standpoint, that means that the response has been limited because, as we're rolling out all these sanctions, indictments, loud, boisterous name and shame things, if you really go after the people who are most evidentially involved, you're talking about the prime minister, his cousin, his father, who was the former prime minister, senators, advisors to the prime minister, et cetera, et cetera. If you do that, your bilateral relationship is gone. Quite similarly, in China's perspective, if you just take one of these actors who was eventually extradited to China, this was someone who had outstanding criminal legal trouble in China. If you're talking about Chen Zhe, almost going back almost a decade. And the Chinese government it's very clear that when they need to recall a citizen, they're able to put pressure on countries to do that. But this is an individual who is not merely a criminal. It's someone who had arisen to a cabinet level position of influence. And so it's not necessarily that China could not have reclaimed him, but doing so would have been bilaterally destabilizing. And I think it's really important when you look at the sometimes seemingly selective, contradictory responses by both the US and China and other countries in the region. It's important to remember that these are shaped by an array of competing state interests. Now, going to the host governments, different state actors play different roles, probably the most important being the host states. And when you look at a place like Cambodia, I think contrary to conventional understanding, host states are not simply weak states that have been overtaken by criminal industries. They're oftentimes, and in Cambodia's case particularly, selectively capable. Cambodia has proven that when they're properly motivated, they can effectively raid expendable operators. But at the same time, they are very effective at shielding the politically connected owners, the landholders, the officials. We sort of talked about this a little bit earlier, but there are lots of different modes of how a state actor can become involved. And in Cambodia, I think, which we've talked about the most, is sort of a stable form of politically and state-enabled criminality. But in Myanmar, that's not the case at all. The industry is effectively driven by the fragmentation of the state, still certainly by political settlements between the junta and its proxies at the border, in the border areas. But this is very much part of a conflict economy in Myanmar, and so I think what we're seeing is the emergence of a new reality where foreign criminal capital can be absorbed into many different types of political settlements in ways that allow for effectively, I think what you've seen over the last 6 to 9 months, both in Myanmar and in Cambodia, is the use of like pressure relief valves. So like visible operators can be sacrificed, but those deeper protection architectures can easily survive. And so, I think that leads into kind of the next sets of questions about like what can actually be done about this. Where are their alignments? Because even as strong as China and the US are in their respective influences, the small states, the host states, really have been winning this game in their ability to maneuver between aggressive state response to try to crack down on this and sort of play against the different geopolitical tensions that exist.
Thanks, Jake. Sue-Lin, turning back to you. As the scam industry proliferates across the region, we've talked a lot about what the US and China are doing, but how are governments across Southeast Asia responding and handling the issue on their own terms, both in terms also of, how they're receiving efforts by Beijing and Washington, and then what they're doing themselves to address the issue?
So I like to say that Southeast Asia is perhaps the most diverse region in the whole world. And my joke is that there are only 3 things that bind it, being all the countries are geographically proximate on a map, the food is very good everywhere, and everyone believes in ghosts. But as a result, I think that means the responses have been really vastly different because almost every country in this region has a different political structure, different sort of economic setup. Of course, the religions are different. We've been going on about all the differences. So if I were to just hone in, well, first of all, I think that means that it's very, very difficult to come up with some kind of coordinated response across all countries. But that having been said, I think there are some interesting case studies. So I would say of all the countries in Southeast Asia, Singapore has the best response in terms of trying to protect its citizens, which perhaps is different from, going after the systemic drivers of the industry that we've been talking about today. But I think Singapore has really been hit by this industry. Criminals know Singaporeans are some of the wealthiest, it's one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And so Singapore set up this anti-scam center, which is kind of a centralized hub. So if anyone gets scammed, I know we've spoken about pig butchering scams, sort of romance and crypto scams, but there are so many different kinds of scams that are being run by these criminal syndicates we're talking about today. And so when a Singaporean is a target of any one of these kinds of scams, they can immediately report it to this center, which has police, it has banks, I think it has some e-commerce companies. And so very quickly, there can be this sort of holistic response to try to stop the stolen money from leaving Singaporean borders, because once it leaves Singaporean borders, it's incredibly difficult. And I think now we're seeing this model replicated in other parts of the region. And on top of that, there's huge awareness campaigns everywhere I go in Singapore. I was just riding the subway yesterday, and there were anti-scam ads everywhere. So there's lots of different sort of responses from the government to try to protect citizens. And then on the sort of other end of the scale, you have what Selina and Jake were talking about, a country like Myanmar, which we can't even really think of as a country. I think of it more as sort of warring fiefdoms in a Game of Thrones like story, which I think was what Selina was trying to get at, where you've got the military junta that in theory holds power, but in fact there are large areas of the country that are controlled by these ethnic armed organizations. And in a way, China has in a very sophisticated way, used its leverage over the junta as well as over these sort of Game of Thrones ethnic armed organizations to try to get what it wants when it comes to cracking down on scams. And so in the case of Myanmar, the junta and these ethnic armed organizations are responding more to China and China's unhappiness with what is happening in Myanmar in terms of how these criminal organizations are stealing billions of dollars from Chinese people. And so the only other thing I would add on that is that China has huge amounts of leverage in Myanmar. So just to take an example, last year I was given a leaked transcript of a talk between a Chinese envoy to Myanmar and an ethnic armed group. And China was unhappy. I won't get into the details, but China was unhappy with what this ethnic armed group was doing. And basically, this ethnic armed group, it kept most of its money in Chinese banks on the Chinese side of the border. Its leaders would go into China for medical treatment. Its communities relied on Chinese internet, Chinese electricity, Chinese water. And as a result, the Chinese government has so much leverage over an ethnic armed group like this one, compared to, say, Cambodia or Laos, where China just doesn't have that kind of direct leverage. And so as a result, what it can do is incredibly different in these different kinds of situations, which I think is a point that Jake and Selina were making as well. But sort of going back to thinking about just Singapore versus Myanmar. I've picked the two most extreme examples in Southeast Asia, but those responses are just so radically different because one is a nation state and one is, quite frankly, not. It's really, really difficult to sort of summarize a coherent response across Southeast Asia or even sort of find commonality between different government responses in Southeast Asia. But I would broadly say that there is much, much more awareness among governments across this region in terms of just how big a problem the global scam industrial complex is than many other countries in the world.
Thanks, Sue-Lin. And one thing I also want to point out is the role of Thailand in coordinating some of these actions. You know, they've worked with both the U.S. and China on addressing cyber scams along their border with Myanmar, and recently launched a program called SHIELD to help facilitate intelligence sharing, both with the U.S. and China, as well as other countries. I think there are around 10 members right now. So it's another example of countries in the region kind of taking a little bit of a step forward in organizing responses as they're seeing both the U.S. and China act intensely. And so Thailand played an important role in a rare joint raid in April with the UAE, China, and the US that led to the arrest of 276 scammers in Dubai. You know, the issue of cyber scamming is an issue that both the US and China have shared strategic interest in, but it's also an issue where there's a lot of misalignment in terms of incentives and strategic interests. As evidenced I already mentioned that. So how plausible, I want to ask, do you think that in the future, how plausible do you think that there's any future of U.S.-China collaboration on this issue, and what might need to be done to make it happen? Jake, can we lead with you on this one? I believe you're muted. Sorry.
There we go. I think case you pointed out is a good one, but I would call that less of a collaboration, more so as sort of like a technical, hyper tactical type of cooperation, and I think that's probably the most likely. It's not the best for the world. It's not actually the best for U.S. or Chinese citizens, but I think it's probably the most likely, just given the reality, because you do see significant alignment, as you said. Both countries' citizens are losing enormous amounts of money. Both countries benefit when the major operators and laundering channels get disrupted. But both countries are also deeply inwardly focused and not exactly in ways that are likely to allow for more incentive alignment. I think if you can say one thing about the U.S. and China response that is most similar is it's a U.S. like America first, a China first sort of approach, which definitely has the ability to displace harms onto other countries. So that's problematic. We've already touched extensively on China's sort of extensive focus on their own reputational management, which also sort of facilitates more inward focus. And I think the misalignments kind of grow from there. So you have like misalignments also on in-state. So the U.S. response is ultimately grounded and most effective when it is sort of pushing against the significant, profound exposure that the world, criminal and otherwise, has to the dollar. I think the U.S. has done quite well on that, but that's kind of a U.S. Specific type of response. The U.S. also has a comparative advantage in whether or not it has accepted that or not is definitely up for debate. But in leveraging sort of a normative rule of law based international order. And China's response, as it has been bilateral, multilateral, trilateral, has appeared much more as using this crisis. Selina started to speak about this, in part to advance its own global security initiative and to deepen these sort of parallel state-led security relationships across the region, which is sort of deeply out of alignment with what the U.S. government would likely like to see happen. There's also operating style differences. Like the U.S. tends to favor these loud public attribution, indictment, sanctions, and a sort of more open, loud, shaming, but transparent legal process, where Beijing tends to prefer quieter, opaque state-to-state enforcement repatriation. So, I mean, there's obviously tons of real capability, complementarity, but I think there are like real practical and geopolitical differences that make deep strategic collaboration really, really unlikely.
Thank you. Selina, Sue-Lin, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, maybe before I add to Jacob's really comprehensive answer, maybe I could react to what you just said about and what Sue-Lin also said about Singapore. The Singapore one is an anecdote, but I'll talk about the differences between one of the key issues that you kind of alluded to, but not quite directly mentioned it, is that because China could intervene so much in Myanmar, primarily because they share a border, a very, very long border. Very different from the case, and we are talking about the northern Shan State area, right? So the northern border with Yunnan province, which is actually together with the central government, they are the key Chinese actors in trying to deal with the scams and the criminal activities. So the reason, so they are much more influential in the north, in northern Shan State in particular, but they actually need to rely on Thailand when it comes to the criminal groups that are operating in the Thailand-Myanmar border, the Chinese criminal groups there. So this is when Thailand is actually much more influential. Thailand is the one that is responsible for switching off the electricity that disrupts all the online operations, right? Online gambling. So it really is about shared borders as well. This particular how much China can do as interest in intervening, because shared borders, one of the key things will be these activities are not only bad for its citizens on its side of the borders, because they are the ones who get trafficked, right? And they are the ones who go to these places for gambling and all sorts of things. But it also is about border security for China. It's a national security concern in that sense. To Sue-Lin's point about Singapore and the kind of stuff that we've been doing in this country to deal with scams is almost incredible. The layers of securities that we meet. I just want to give an anecdote about what happened to me when I went to the bank recently to withdraw some money. A pretty large amount of money that I wanted to take out and put it somewhere else. Three bank officers, like the normal, the person that is over the counter, then the person's boss, and then the person's boss, asked me the same questions. Why are you withdrawing the money? Where is it going? And do you know the person that you are dealing with when it comes to this investment that you want to make? It is standard practice for them. I was like, wow, I have to answer this question 3 times. So all the banks in Singapore are very much in this whole operation of trying to deal with this, these scams, and trying to prevent, it's not just elderly people that are victims of gangs, of these scams, but apparently there is a wide range in the age group and in terms of education and all sorts of things. So it's not just older people who may not be aware of these things as much, but it's a wide range of people that are being scammed, and banks are very much in the front line of trying to stop these activities. So that's me sharing about my recent experience at the bank. I was asking the manager, the people there, and said, whoa, that's really a lot of questions, but it's good. It's good questions because the idea is that they want people to think, to reflect whether they should be sending this money to some place before they act. So this is just an anecdote of what happened to me recently. But to your question more directly, and building on what Jake have already mentioned, I think one key issue that I really want to underline and underscore is this issue of trust. I think this is where the bottom line, with the crux of the issue of misalignment, right? I think there is a lot of opportunities for cooperation. I mean, Chinese citizens are so badly affected by this. American citizens are so badly affected by this. If you think about that, there's a lot of shared interest in that way, right? But, on top of what Jake mentioned, there is that lack of trust. There are people in the US, there's always a lot of suspicion about whether Beijing is actually involved in these groups. The Beijing do this purposely. When I say Beijing, I mean the central government, the CCP government. So there are reports where some of these groups have links to state-owned enterprises. They have links to United Front organizations. They have links to provincial governments, right? But I think we need to remember that these links do not mean that it is coordinated from Beijing. And it does not mean that Beijing actually even knows what's going on. If you know the complexity of the Chinese government, there's so many layers of government that the one right at top doesn't know what's happening right at the bottom, right? So it's really difficult to establish that, this is a centrally coordinated, politically motivated thing to target Americans and other people in the world, right? And to be honest, right? I mean, some of these criminal organizations actually have legitimate businesses. And if you think about the context of any other legitimate businesses, they always have contacts with government. So it is normal that there's always this business politics link, right? So, I mean, if you think about it in this context, these criminal groups, they have some parts of the business that are legitimate and some parts of it are, illicit or illegal. They have links with government. That's also not surprising, right? So there is this lack of trust, and trust is needed when you talk about intelligence sharing, joint operations, enforcement. These are very sensitive issues, right? The sharing of data, of personal data of victims, for example, would be a huge issue. Yeah.
Thanks, Selina. Thanks, Jake. And we're going to hop on to the last question just so we can hopefully squeeze in one Q&A. But flagging that we have a report coming out from ASPI assessing opportunities for collaboration, the risks behind it, recommendations for policymakers on broaching China. That'll be coming out next week. So please keep an eye on the Asia Society website for that. Sue-Lin, I want to start with you on the last question of our webinar, and that's next steps for addressing the scam industry in Southeast Asia. As the US and China and other countries in the region are thinking about how the industry is evolving, especially in response to recent crackdowns, what are core considerations and what needs to be done?
I think it's a really, really difficult question. For those of us who work on it, in a way, it's a very dispiriting question because this is such a wicked problem. I would say at a personal level, I think we all just need to sort of raise awareness with our family, friends, neighbors, like talk to people about this industry and sort of try and explain that this is an incredibly sophisticated multi-billion-dollar industry, and the way it, regardless of how it reaches out and touches your own life, and it will touch your own life if it hasn't already. I think on that, if you know someone who has fallen for one of these scams, whether they're a complex, slow burn romance scam or a really quick phishing scam, how you react is really important. And I think there's an instinct that we shame people and we say, how could you be so stupid? But actually, the more I study this industry, the more I think I could fall for one of these such scams if I were in a certain state of mind. and then everyone should have a family code word as AI becomes more and more sophisticated, and the criminals can use sort of voice altering software to change their voices to make them sound like I'm calling my mom when it's not actually me. So chat to your family and know a secret code word that you can use to test if you're skeptical of a frantic phone call you suddenly get from your son or your daughter or your mother. But beyond the personal, I would say that the issue with tackling this industry is if you think about how a scam works, it usually starts on a telecoms platform. It perhaps moves to a social media platform, an e-commerce platform, some kind of online app. And then it will go to your bank and then a crypto exchange. And it's only at that point that you might even realize that you've been scammed. A lot of people don't realize that they've fallen for a scam, or even if they do, they don't report it. And it's only at that point that law enforcement might get involved, or different parts of your government might get involved. And at this point, we haven't even left your own country's borders. So I just think it's an incredibly complex scam chain, as I call it, and every single part of this chain has responsibilities. And in a way, there needs to be, we've spoken a lot about US-China coordination, but actually there has to be so much other coordination before we even get to that point, which, as I think Jake and Selina have alluded to, is incredibly difficult given just how, just the current state of the US-China relationship, putting scams aside. There's so many other massive issues in that relationship and so little trust. And so I think really trying to understand the scam chain, and if you work in an industry that is part of it, like understanding where your industry fits in is incredibly important.
Thanks, Sue-Lin. Selina, Jake, do you have anything to add?
Sure, I can hop in just real quickly. I think certainly we have to go after the drivers, and Sue-Lin correctly said, lack of awareness is a big one. We've also alluded to the labor vulnerabilities that are driving this. The third one being just complete and utter lack of accountability. And I'll focus just quickly on that. We really, really need to stop viewing this issue as a compound issue and look more at the protection system. So the owners, the financiers, the landholders, the corrupt officials, and the systems that are providing the infrastructure and the ecosystem where this can occur. We need to start looking at ways to apply friction to all of that. And one of the best ways to do that, so like second part of this answer is, as I mentioned earlier, we really need to protect the evidence pipeline. So the local journalists, the local civil society groups, the investigators, the survivors. We've sort of spent most of this hour talking about the web of interest that prevent ultimately a really straightforward, helpful, uniformly positive response, even from really powerful governments like the U.S. and China. And those local groups, the local evidence providers, have independence from some of those political constraints and trust issues that not only expose information, but also make inaction for stuff that we already know impossible. And so we need to protect those people and make sure that they have an ability to keep doing their work. And ultimately, yeah, as Sue-Lin said, we need a coalition that can respond to this holistically. And whereas I think there are severe practical implications to a major U.S.-China or a major private sector-led response, that is ultimately what this is going to take. It's going to take a global response, a whole of society response, if we want to see progress here.
Yeah, I agree with what Sue-Lin and Jacob has said. I think of a global task force to deal with scams and these forms of crime. But I don't want to say too much here because I think we're running out of time. So maybe we should yield the floor to the participants here.
Absolutely. And we'll just throw in that final question, and Selina will give time to wrap up and quick final remarks. But one question we have in from the audience is about the influence, whether or not the U.S. is really stepping in now to weigh in on scam issues to counter China's influence in Southeast Asia, and implications for sovereignty behind some of China's approaches to combating the scam epidemic. Jake, do you want to weigh in on this one briefly?
Sorry, I cut out. I'm not.
Oh, no worries, no worries. The question was just, consider sovereignty considerations in this. How is the U.S. thinking about the influence of China's operations on the sovereignty of countries like Thailand, per se?
Yeah, I mean, I think Selina probably addressed this best, and there's like a major trust issue between the two countries. I do think that whereas there's totally not great evidence to support the idea of a big Beijing-run conspiracy. There's absolutely good evidence that China is using this crisis to promote their global security initiative, which runs counter to U.S. interests, and whether that's a sovereignty issue or not remains up for debate. But it certainly is pursuing the development of parallel channels of bilateral collaboration that are not in line with U.S. interests. And so, while we can say like, for the good of the world and people in it, we should hope that the U.S. and China collaborate. There are real sort of national security reasons why China would probably prefer not to do that, or the U.S. would probably prefer not to do that, and why you might, in good faith, advise each of those countries to hold their cards a little bit more closely. And yeah, I do think that is a challenge. Whether or not that is truly a sovereignty issue, I think is really up for debate.
Got it. Thanks. Sue-Lin, can we start with you for final 30 seconds of any other comments you have, any things you want to bring up, or conclusions from the talk?
Actually, I might just jump in and elaborate on Jake's answer to that question. I think as someone who's been in the region for the past few years covering sort of the US here and China here, I think the US has done immense damage to itself by shutting down USAID, by cutting off funding to local journalists, as we've spoken about. I think there's a lot of ways that the US has harmed its own interests in Southeast Asia that are completely separate from what China is doing here. That having been said, clearly China is doing a lot more in Southeast Asia to try to fight scams, to protect its own people. It's a very sort of realpolitik foreign policy, just as America's foreign policy towards fighting scams is also very much about what is best for American citizens. But I think when it comes to questions of how can the US and China collaborate on scams in particular, I think a really, really important questions are, well, what does the US want from China, and what can it offer China? And what does China want? What does China want from the US when it comes to scams? And what can it offer China? And just given China's incredibly comprehensive presence in Southeast Asia and the fact that it's been tackling the scam issue for so many more years, the reality is that China has a huge advantage and a head start in terms of trying to protect its own citizens from scams compared to the US. And that's terrible for Americans who are losing a lot of money. But if we're trying to understand what is happening in this region, not as we perhaps want it to be, but as it is, I think that that's an incredibly important thing to bear in mind.
Thank you. Selina, any final thoughts?
Yeah. So maybe just to add on what I was talking about, a task force. So I think that next year Singapore is ASEAN chair. And one of the things I hope Singapore will do is to propose the idea of a ASEAN task force plus partners, ASEAN plus partners task force, which means ASEAN plus the US plus China plus Japan plus South Korea, New Zealand, Australia in this task force. But of course, that seems a little bit of a big wish. There's quite a big hurdle to overcome. Considering that, different countries have different approaches and different interests, a degree of interest, involvement of certain elites in some of these operations. So it's going to be tough, but I think you can start with something small. And it can be very technical in the way that some of these operations have just been very technical. But the more you work together and to try and solve these things, over time, you can build trust. Hopefully, So it is about starting small and then growing bigger. There is already a sort of a task force, a group, a center that is in the mainland Southeast Asia part, right? With Thailand being involved as well and all that. So I think we can build on that. It doesn't need to be just a mainland Southeast Asia thing. It can be an ASEAN-driven thing. And I think I have the pleasure of reading the first draft of your very excellent report that will come out next week. I think you mentioned third party, right? Mediators and all that as well. So ASEAN can be a third party mediator between the US and China, right? Barring all the geopolitical difficulties, also between China and Japan, all these considerations apart. But we can start somewhere, start small, and start in a technical manner and build it up over time, because this requires a global effort. It has to be a global effort. Otherwise, I don't know how can you track where the financial stuff is going, and so you need to have really good command of you need to track the financial flows. And actually, I think the US is very good in terms of controlling the levers of the international financial system, and that's a huge advantage for the Americans, which the Chinese do not have, and which the Chinese could benefit from. I mean, there are all these competitive advantages that people can leverage on and cooperate and deal with this global scourge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thanks, Selina. Appreciate it. And Jake, we'll give you the final word before wrapping this. I know we're over time.
I can cede the floor. That was a great ending comment.
Great. Perfect. All right. Well, thank you to our experts who joined us on this call from Singapore and early in the US. Appreciate everyone for tuning in this morning.